Good afternoon. My name is Austin Roos. I'm president of CFAM, the Center for Family and Human Rights. We work on life and family issues at the UN. I'm up here pinch hitting for my lovely and talented wife, Kathy, who right this second is home watching this on her computer because she's sick as a dog and has been for 9 straight days. She has one of those things that simply won't go away. You know, we watched the Super Bowl, like a lot of people, on Sunday, and I missed the Coca-Cola commercial. Did you catch the Coca-Cola commercial that talked about Coke is for he and she and her and me and them, and pointed to a woman who is gender non-binary? And I don't know if you caught Justin Trudeau, the pajama boy who runs the government in Canada, who corrected a woman in a public Q&A who referred to mankind, and he corrected her and says, oh, no, we use the word people kind. This afternoon, Kathy and I are taking the girls, if Kathy's well enough, of course, to this movie about P.T. Barnum. And in the movie of P.T. Barnum, there's a bearded lady. And we're on pins and needles whether the bearded lady is going to be played as transsexual, you know? And so we'll wait and see. I suspect not, but you never know these days. And it just seems to me that where are we when even the bearded lady is politicized as a society? We have had Stella Morabito as a speaker at the United Nations, where she spoke to a packed crowd of radical feminists and gender non-binaries. We took her to speak at a conclave of mostly Muslim diplomats in order to tell them about what's really going on with kind of mind control on all of these particular issues. And she's simply remarkable. Stella is a senior contributor at the Federalist. She has a master's degree in Russian and Soviet history. She worked for roughly a decade in intelligence before staying home to raise her family. At that point, her interest in propaganda overlapped with her observations of the rapidly changing cultural landscape in America, which is what we're dealing with all the time. She spoke here 2 years ago about how transgenderism is being used as a propaganda vehicle to enforce censorship. And in each of the instances, each of the anecdotes that I gave you just a second ago are all about that. And it's all about isolating the individual. This is what she's taught me over the years, isolating the individual so that they don't have the courage, the wherewithal to stand alone against the propaganda that's coming at them. And it's hard for adults. It's harder still for children. So she's going to be talking today about social and emotional learning that is happening right now in the school system in Fairfax County and around the world. I just want to have her comment right away. My girls, when we took her to Lake George to talk to the UN diplomats, my girls, Lucy and Gigi, in a gag store found her a little tin of what was labeled mind control pills. So I want to know if and they gave them to her, and I want to know if the mind control pills actually worked. The marvelous Stella Morabito.
Thank you so much, Austin. Really appreciate that introduction. And I'm so sorry Kathy isn't here, and I hope she gets better soon. And it's just really an honor to be here. I'm going to get right into it because it's kind of longish, but I want time for Q&A. It's an honor because the Family Research Council does such heroic work, especially standing up to groupthink and the silencing tactics of propagandists, which is exactly what I've come here to talk about. And it's an honor to be here also on Ronald Reagan's birthday, February 6th. So I first want to say that aside from my writing and professional background, a lot of what I've learned comes just from being a persistent observer of social dynamics. And this is something that each and every one of us can do. And I think it's important that we do this. That's a big part of the solution, to get clued in on exactly how these dynamics work, or more clued in on the mechanics of them. So I have a big picture approach for this talk about the curriculum of social and emotional learning, or abbreviated SEL, which I've taken liberties to call it social emotional programming because I believe that's what it is. Oh, my phone. It's the idea, basically, that a monolithic public school system should have some kind of a nationalized mandate to tell children exactly how to feel and how to relate to people. And I think whenever you have people advocating for government intrusion into personal emotions and relationships, you're dealing with a pretty large-scale propaganda operation. So my talk today is really an invitation to explore. Austin got into some of this stuff. I'm so happy to learn, about how he's thought, and a lot of other people, about the isolation of the individual and how important it is to understand how that works on us. So I am going to be taking a few detours, and I ask your patience, but because mostly what I want to do is dig deeply into the propaganda of political correctness and how it affects people on a very deep psychological level. So my goal is pretty ambitious. You can read here after a basic introduction and to give some background on SEL. I'm going to break the talk into four parts. And in the first part, it's my thesis that SEL actually serves an agenda to dictate and regulate all personal relationships. Think about what that means. Second part, I'm going to look at the ways, I call it the software, how emotional dynamics are at play in achieving that control. And in the third part, I want to take a more clinical look. I call it the hardware, the machinery of propaganda and thought reform. And finally, I'll take a little time to address a solution. And one note going forward is that many of my slides include book covers in case you want to read some of the books that I'd recommend. So not so brief introduction. So first thing you need to know is that the main driver of social and emotional learning is an organization that calls itself the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which we'll abbreviate CASEL. Now, they claim their project will help both children and adults develop 5 basic skills, and just look at the highlighted parts here. They make them more self-aware, help regulate their emotions, and show empathy, have positive relationships, make responsible decisions. These are all, I think we'd all agree, excellent things that parents should teach their children. So just so you can get familiar with CASEL's Bill of Goods and their rationale, I'm going to play a few clips from their PR video officially up on its website. In the first clip, try to objectively observe the advertising effects of this cell, of this hard cell, the compelling slow-mo imagery of happy children who get along just so swimmingly at school.
What do you really want for your children? You want them to be happy, healthy, able to relate to other people.
Now, the next clip, the CEO of CASEL is going to explain the rationale for it, that it's the only way that a lot of kids will get critical life skills. Of course, they got to make it universal, so it's every kid in their image. But it's interesting to me how bureaucrats suddenly seem to have just discovered how miserable so many kids are in school, but not why they're miserable. I think even generations ago, kids, if they could have articulated it, would have told them, it's the bureaucracy, stupid. But, so, this is...
If we don't teach them in school, a lot of children are not getting these most basic, most important critical life skills.
Our children are begging us for the right to believe in themselves and the right to be inspired. The children are crying out and saying, I don't see purpose in my life. I don't have a dream anymore.
Okay, so there you have that one. Now the next clip, we're going to learn that CASEL needs, and listen for it, the whole child. We will hear that content knowledge is nothing but a commodity, and that kids can look that stuff up on the internet anytime they want. They don't need a teacher to tell them anything about the Civil War or when it happened. The board chairman, Tim Shriver, will explain also, he'll just basically explain that and how learning content is secondary to being programmed into Castle's ideas of the correct feelings and attitude. And this clip, I'm going to let it go for a little while because it will close with a call to mobilize and make SEL universal. Get it into every school.
We have the evidence. We know it works. We have the compelling argument that we need the whole child. I think it is our time to really capitalize on it.
We actually do have evidence now. We did not have it 15 years ago. I mean, to be fair, we were in the R&D phase in the field of social and emotional learning. We're not in that phase anymore. Content is more and more of a commodity. Children own what they want now at very young ages. They will become self-directed. They can find out the dates of the Civil War without learning it from a teacher. So the question that they're bringing to school is, who am I? How do I work with you? How do we build a team? What is our purpose? Where do I fit? That nurture children to believe that it's worth learning.
More of our administrators.
So the next clip will give you the big bureaucratic picture, basically caring by committee. They explained that they wrote lots of books about emotions and emotional intelligence. Now, surprise, they figured out that kids need nurturing, but only through a government-imposed mandate for the schools to teach everyone how to do this. And families are basically sidelined to be cheerleaders. That's their role for the SEL agenda. But I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And this will be the final clip from Castle.
Together, the collaborative side of Castle and the learning side are really important.
We work in research, we work in practice, and we work in policy.
And we committed ourselves to a school change strategy.
We spent the last 20 years learning about and studying social and emotional learning. We've written many books and guides and have been deeply immersed in this work. We then took the very research orientation to practice in large urban districts to help districts implement systemic SEL at the district level, at the building level, at the classroom level. It's exciting to be at a place in time where we as a country finally know enough about how kids are going to learn and learn best.
Okay, so the experts, they'll tell you all how to nurture. I'm not going to focus much on the inner workings or content of SEL. I'm going to talk a little about that, but for all of that, I recommend to you the excellent work of a lot of people, including Dr. Karen Affron, who's a pediatrician of the Education Liberty Watch, and Jane Robbins, of American Principles Project, and there are many more. So they can fill you in on things like basically the makeup of Castle, which includes a board member named Linda Darling Hammond, who was Bill Ayers, I don't know, the domestic terrorist Bill Ayers' choice for Obama's Secretary of Education. So pretty radical stuff. The status of SEL in legislatures, they can fill you in on that. Proposals for collection of mental health data on children, including digital learning, which would actually measure kids' physiological responses, their pulse rate or sweat or whatever, while they answer invasive questions about their feelings. You can learn also about the pet projects of Castle's partners. Castle has a lot of partners dealing with various agenda items like you'll have the transcendental meditation through that 1440 Foundation, or, you can just, some of these other pet projects and pet agendas, all of which require, they would want universal mandates to teach them. So, and of course, the Arcus Foundation, another big, LGBT pusher in the schools. So what you can see from that is that both the content and the process of Castle are status in nature. So I see it as a vehicle for a much bigger agenda. Its intent, of course, is to make the curriculum universal. Think of it as groupthink 10.0. We're the government and we're here to help. The net effect is to build a collective mindset. And when you look at it, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of good people who have fallen into that trap of utopian thinking. And utopian thinking by nature is always collectivist. It's, it doesn't regard the individual. The idea is to build an utterly predictable world. but that always requires complete conformity. And it's nothing new in human history. I mean, actually, I think that's a default position in human history, the drive to make remake humanity and, some elite's image. Dystopian novels describe the process, building that mechanical, predictable world, kind of like an anesthetizing effect. I think a lot of people, if you read about that sort of thing. And I want to recommend that novel in the middle there, We, by Yevgeny Zamyatin. It's an old, it's about 100 years old. George Orwell, by the way, reviewed that novel for the London Tribune in the 40s, and it actually inspired him to write 1984. So that's just a little tidbit there, detour. But how do you build a predictable world? Well, everybody has to lose their individuality, like in a blender. And this is a great quote I found when I was searching for collectivist and blender, because that idea occurred to me. Lawrence Reed wrote it. It's a fantastic quote. Collectivists see the world the way Mr. Magoo did. It's one big blur. They homogenize people in a communal blender, sacrificing the discrete features that make us who we are. So to understand what's at stake, I think we need to focus more on understanding the process of SEL, the process of that kind of propaganda, rather than on the content. The content, like all the pet agenda projects, that's like playing a game of whack-a-mole. I think you got to get into the machinery of it all. And but the process is, kind of three phases: propaganda, kind of developing like the whole hard sell campaign, and then the agitation, the mobilization of the masses to get with it, and then you end up with total compliance and conformity. That's the idea, to build that world. And the only way to do that is by controlling personal one-on-one relationships, right? I mean, what you say to somebody could affect how they think, how they feel. So controlling relationship is key. And so I'm going to get started with my 4 points, my thesis: software, thought reform, hardware, and some suggestions. So the ultimate effect of SEL is the regulation of all personal relationships. Now, how dare I say such a thing? Because the massive bureaucratic scope and ambitions of the program take us there. At some point in my life, I realized that personal relationships are really the source of all knowledge. And therefore, that's the source of all power. I mean, everybody says, knowledge is power. But where does this knowledge come from? I mean, you get it through your relationships. Even if you're just reading a book, it's a communication with others and other ideas. So it begins with a mother-child bond, but everything we learn comes through our relationships with others. And as long as we're free to create our own relationships, they're a source of knowledge and freedom to us. But otherwise, we're actually driven into a form of social isolation. So if anybody was able to control all relationships, they'd have a monopoly on power, right? This is exactly what totalitarians have aimed at doing for millennia, by controlling language, thoughts, feelings, and behavior. It's really about separating people in the name of togetherness, is what it is, a classic divide and conquer. And I think the folks at CASEL really accept my premise. Here's a screenshot of one of their facts from their website, which asks, why is SEL essential to school and, success? And it goes on, blah, 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 blah. But it ends with this key statement: relationships are the engine of learning. And I absolutely agree. The question is, should the keys to that engine of learning be given only to one monolithic monopoly on learning? And I would guess that, if you look at where this is going, that's what they're asking. So to understand this better, let's look at how relationships have been traditionally influenced in our American way of life. They come through what are known as the mediating institutions of society. And they're institutions that I call buffer zones between the individual and the encroachment of state power into our private lives. Now, there are a lot of different mediating institutions, but the three big ones that that drive our relationships are basically the family, church, and I'm throwing in their voluntary associations, whether it's a service association, a club, or, whatever gets you connected with other people. And these institutions are truly diverse, and they influence us in a diversity of ways. And because of that, they help us learn to think for ourselves, exchange ideas, and develop real relationships as individuals. Like if you look at this at the Institution of Religion, and consider this Norman Rockwell painting. It depicts the golden rule as a primary principle, not just in Christianity, but in many other religions. So the idea of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you is about right relationship with human beings as unique individuals, which is taught through religions. And next, consider the old-fashioned term good manners. Now, these are traditionally reinforced not through just church and family, but through voluntary associations and civic societies of various types, scouts or whatever. And Emily Poe stressed that good etiquette all boiled down to just being sensitive to the feelings of others. And finally, and that, by the way, used to be taught in schools once upon a time when schools respected, the institution of family. But looking at the institution of the family, we see that as the arbiter of their child's role in those mediating institutions. The parents decide which church, which associations to join, and this is where true organic community begins. It cannot be built through bureaucracy. So let's think of the mediating institutions as the fulcrum that provides the balance between extreme individualism and extreme statism. And promotes healthy functioning in society. So the government mandated social emotional learning proposal is really the clearest indicator, I think, of the blatant intent for basically a state absorption of the role of the mediating institutions, especially of church and family. The parent's role is reduced to supporting CASEL's agenda in the home. I mean, if you just look at this fact from their websites, it asked what parents can do, and basically the answer is the parent's job is to adopt the public schools SEL program and conform to it and model it at home. Now, I can hear SEL advocates saying, no, not at all. It's just, it's basically a program to help kids reduce their anxiety and help them get along better in school. And, I understand that in the SEL, but basically what we're dealing with is a bait and switch. The problem is we can't take their arguments at face value if they're going to require total compliance with their methods, with their content, with their monopoly on how children are taught. So when a curriculum like this is mandated, it's going to require conformity. That's what they do, PC conformity, politically correct conformity, which is what all this does. It does more to weaken human relationships than to nurture them. I think we all know this in our gut, but we need to kind of spell it out. Because the net effect of enforced conformity is to isolate us from one another. Now, I'm going to take a detour for a little bit. So, where would any takeover of personal relationships begin? I know I answered on this slide, but I think you all know it's got to begin in the family. And to get to that, you got to begin with undermining marriage. And the big tip-off to me is reading a book by a woman she's not officially a member of CASEL, but she argues along the same lines for big government and universal mandates as a solution for broken relationships, as a solution for broken institutions, basically with the idea of taking care of the vulnerable, but she wants it, universal. It's a gender legal theorist named Martha Feynman. Now, libertarians take note. Why would she argue in this book called The Autonomy Myth for the universal abolition of all state recognition of marriage? Okay, I want libertarians to take note. Basically, to promote state involvement in our personal relationships by having it absorb the mediating institution of the family. I mean, these quotes really jumped out at me in her book. It seems apparent to me, and she's talking about, when she's talking about institutional protection of government recognized marriage, which basically means the government restrains itself from getting involved in the relationship. So she says, it seems apparent to me that a lot more regulation, protection would occur once interactions between individuals within families were removed from the veil of privacy that now shields them. And then she outdoes herself with this next line. Once that institutional protection was removed, behavior would be judged by standards established to regulate interactions among all members of society. So let that sink in. Another detour here, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I would just want to say a few words on relationships versus isolation because it's all very counterintuitive. If we're not free to express differences of thought, we can't have relationships, period. But there is a balance between having differences of feelings and thoughts and having a code to live by. So if we're all the same, we're basically robots, right? There's no relationships. But if we're so different that we can't verify reality with one another, like we see a lot in this whole gender ideology thing, we live in isolation. The mediating institutions, family, church, voluntary associations, they play a role in achieving the balance that we all need. Main thing to remember is that if we are stifled in self-expression, our relationships are stifled. And we can already see how identity politics is separating us so that we can hardly even talk to one another anymore. And that's a time-tested recipe for tyranny. And I think it's interesting to look back 200 years at this quote from Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, where he stated exactly that. A tyrant puts all his care into isolating people. He pardons the governed for not loving him, provided they do not love each other. So I think we ought to take that to heart, and I believe people of goodwill have underestimated the impact of social psychology. The elites pushing these agendas understand the inner workings very well. It's all about behavior modification through thought reform. So part 2, I want to move right along here, the ways, the software. This next section, I want to take a look at the isolating effects of political correctness and how it works in general, not just in SEL agendas, but in any agenda that requires political correctness. First, we need to understand that our emotions channel the effects of political correctness in a variety of ways. They nudge our behavior to suit an agenda. They control our language. They control our relationships by polarizing people and change our perceptions of reality. The effect is really to build walls around each one of us, and it controls us by teasing out a sort of self-imposed isolation, the fear of thinking out loud. So when you think of political correctness, it's not so much it's a form of propaganda, but it's more a form of agitation that cultivates the threat and fear of loneliness. That's what it's all about. And we know this best by the way independent thinkers are demonized anytime they might disagree with a PC agenda. And we've heard all of the, all the slurs. Personal favorite there is conspiracy theorists. When you get close to the target, that's the one they like. But the other thing, on the other hand, they reward compliance with labels like, brave, social change agent, and all that. Woke, new one. And so this has a carrot and stick effect, right? So all politically correct agendas always manipulate 2 key emotions. The first is the greatest human desire and need, which is love and connection. And the second, more powerful sometimes, is the greatest human fear, which is loneliness, being, cast into the outer darkness, So conformity and compliance are easily extracted through fear. And when it wends its way into corporations and all this politically correct stuff on campuses, people, they start fear of losing their job, getting a bad grade, social rejection, and that's how you build groupthink. And compliance with groupthink is tied into our survival instinct. Power elites manipulate it because the result is that herd effect of social conformity, which they can then control. A lot of people will insist that they're strong enough to resist that urge to conform. So let's take a little break. I'm kind of halfway. I'm going to try and get through fast. But we'll listen to Steve Martin administer the nonconformist oath.
Okay, good. Now, let's repeat the nonconformist oath. I promise to be different. I promise to be unique. I promise not to repeat things other people say.
So that was just a comedy act, but it does remind us that our very first impulse is to repeat things other people say, right? That's our impulse. They caught on. I'm not so sure they catch on. That was 40 years ago. They catch on so much today. But to understand how deep and primal this fear is, let's remember that the most dreaded punishment is nothing necessarily physical. The most dreaded punishment is solitary confinement. Because separation has not only physical consequences, it has psychic, well, not just psychic, but physical consequences as well. Okay, so the reminder here is that I'm arguing that mass groupthink programs like SEL have the effect of separating people. And that's what it, that's what it purports to prevent, right? That it's about reducing anxiety. That's a cover story, and I'm sure that there are many really, there are good people at Castle who sincerely believe that. But how can you really promote any solid relationships if you require so much across-the-board conformity, total compliance with methods, content, monopoly on how children are taught? Government-mandated conformity into how everybody is supposed to feel and think is bound to put people, especially kids, into straitjackets, as those who express right think are socially rewarded. Those perceived as expressing wrong think will feel the social punishment. You're going to get a lot more polarization. It's collectivism. And I think that the most deeply thoughtful children are going to have the roughest time with it. So by exploiting people's primal fear of loneliness, the thing to remember is politically correct agendas replace thoughtfulness and open conversation with conditioned emotional reflexes. That's what it's built to. I mean, that is what it's geared to build. So when people fear social isolation, how do they react? I've developed this little formula based on these books. Self-censorship plus preference falsification equals the spiral of silence. Self-censorship is when you shut up out of fear of being socially punished. Preference falsification is when you say things you don't really believe, so you get that special pat on the back and you'll get socially rewarded. You're woke or whatever. So as more and more people buy into this sort of thing, they create a snowballing spiral of silence, which creates the illusion, that's the idea, of a public opinion shift. This is what happened with the marriage debate, so-called debate, I'm convinced. You can get a manufactured public opinion cascade that drives public policy. So this next part, I'd like to try to take a more clinical look at the machinery of political correctness and propaganda. Because I don't think we can communicate the dangers of any particular agenda unless we understand how its delivery system works. Otherwise it's like we're on mute, playing whack-a-mole with the different, agenda items. So if you read any of the books on propaganda, you're going to get various definitions. But for our purposes, I define propaganda this way: the process by which power elites condition individuals through psychological manipulation to adapt to an agenda. I should add, to conform to an agenda. That's it in a nutshell. It's about getting those conditioned emotional reflexes, not thoughts, not attitudes, reflexes, to avoid that pain. Now, Margaret Thaler Singer was an expert on cults, and she put together a really useful chart to help us understand the differences between real education and thought reform, or coercive thought reform, otherwise known as brainwashing. And her chart is called the Continuum of Persuasion and Control. And obviously, I can't get into the whole thing. You can find it in that book. But on one end, if you look at the top, you have education, and then way on the other end, in the upper right, you have thought reform. And in between, you have various other forms of influence, advertising, propaganda. indoctrination, which all have, their own technical definitions. And she lists by feature, each, we call it genre, according to their structure, their level of openness, their level of tolerance, their methods, and all of that. So we ought to ask where SEL falls on this spectrum, if you want to call it that. So we'll just look at education on, the upper left and thought reform in the upper right. So the elements of true education is that it's not deceptive. It involves an open, two-way exchange of ideas, focuses on learning about reality. It's consensual. It uses ethical methods that everybody understands. It uses logic. This is real education. On the other hand, thought reform is deceptive. It attempts to change the person without their knowledge. The instruction is authoritative. It's one way, my way, the highway. Or the highway. There's no respect for logic or for individual differences of feelings and beliefs. So that's an excellent chart if you ever want to study that sort of thing. So where exactly does the road of propaganda and thought reform take us? First, I don't think we can underestimate the role of language manipulation in all of this. It's a very opposite of true education. Austin talked about it in the intro, and I'm really glad he did. Gender ideology is an excellent example where it's a vehicle for censorship. I talked about this 2 years ago when I was here. We get things like sex assigned at birth, a false premise written into all these laws. What does that even mean? Well, we know what it's being used for. And then, of course, the worst is the forcing of the pronoun protocols, because the whole purpose of that is to destabilize the entire structure of the language. And of course, words are symbols for thoughts. So basically, it destabilizes thoughts. I can insist that you call me them. It's destabilizing. So the thing also to remember is that most of the partners of CASEL promote policies that regulate speech in that way. Gender ideologists force compliance with those protocols. Environmentalists force compliance, global warming. The list goes on and on. So in this way, anti-speech laws that they would promote isolate people by destabilizing their thought. It's like being put into solitary confinement with your mind. They replace thoughtfulness and conversation with those conditioned emotional reflexes that basically creates a mob mentality. So how do we get on this road? And to understand, again, I'm going to trace the evolution a little bit of gender ideology because it has relied so heavily on propaganda and agitation. It would have gone nowhere without the program of, forcing self-censorship through the threat of social rejection. It basically takes us into the twilight zone. And how does it how it does that is to hide basically a reality while promoting a myth, telling everybody that they have no sex, there is no sex distinction in reality. And of course, my belief is that the trajectory is that, well, if you just follow it, normally it leads to outlawing male and female sex distinctions. That's already being done, birth certificates and all of that. And that, of course, leads to state control over the family. I already read you some quotes on that. And, of course, once that's done, it destabilizes all relationships. And that's, of course, destabilizing thought is key to isolating people. So it may seem we got here at warp speed, but, it had to move fast and furiously. But the groundwork was laid over many decades. Basically, it was a four-stage process that was pushed along by compliance with political correctness. So the first stage, I call it the cultivation of ignorance. Radical education reformers made a point of inhibiting independent thought, not teaching content, basically that combination, cultivates ignorance. It prevents you from really being able to, develop questions and have real conversations about reality. So that laid the groundwork. Students were basically trained to become this kind of mush of emotions where they easily get triggered. Instead of rational thinkers who are able to, they have the capacity to consider a different point of view without going, being bent all out of shape. So it's those emotional reflexes that have been conditioned that create that, what they call the snowflake, response or whatever, fragile. So, then of course you had then once that groundwork was laid, you had the desensitization part of it. And we all know that by the constant bombardment of images through Hollywood or Oprah or, here you got Jenner and Vanity Fair and the media. And the idea is that the shock wears off so that we just comply with it all. But simultaneously with desensitization, anyone with a different opinion gets squashed. And that, like Barronelle Stutzman, Washington florist, who the LGBT lobbyist, has been trying to personally destroy because she didn't devote her creative energy and her independent mind to endorsing their agenda. And of course, the purpose of destroying her livelihood is she's in a basically to affect bystanders to get everybody else with the program. And again, then simultaneously, the final goal, they work through this. So the final goal is conversion and total conformity. That's often done through optics like this one. Now, this is a poster family. Maybe some of you have seen it before. I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's for transgender activism. It shows the older daughter who identifies as a boy being held by the father. Now, these optics were obviously very carefully crafted to do a lot of things. Mostly the crisp, white middle class thing. You got that whole background and all that. And also the use of a female to male instead of the more common male to female transgender, to push it. Now, whether those parents or any other parents who try to tell us that we don't love our children if we don't get with this, whether they realize it or not, the primary use of their story is to promote an ideology designed to allow total state intrusion into all family relationships, including theirs. They don't understand the scope of this, I don't think. And then all personal relationships. And you can ask me at Q&A. But the whole point is to push emotional groupthink and cut off any questions at the knees. So the delivery system for the propaganda comes, as we all know, through the elitist control of all these, major outlets of communication, from the media, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, social media, all that. So obviously, the task in front of us seems daunting, and I'd like to close with just a few ideas about solutions. Since we don't have, control of the major outlets of communication or all of them, the goal needs to be creating a ripple effect to deal with this sort of thing. First thing is to know what we're up against, because understanding process is key. And I recommend, now Nobel laureate Doris Lessing was an icon of feminism, but she wrote this book 30 years ago that explains how her opinion that the laws of mob psychology are not taught because that would end the game for power elites who want to control everyone. She believed children should be taught to resist rhetoric and to examine the mechanisms that govern them and not get sucked into propaganda. I doubt SEL would even entertain that notion of Lessing's. So some ideas going forward is people need to strengthen and organize their support networks to fight groupthink. Partnering has a huge effect on morale and puncturing groupthink. There's a lot of different ways that can be done. I actually have a book club where we examine different books about propaganda and other kinds of ideas, workshops, how you deal with hostility that is no doubt going to grow if this agenda gets a foothold, and understand how coercive thought reform works on us. as Doris Lessing said, that helps, that basically immunizes you. And the next step is to really to decocoon. One reason things are so bad today is the polarization caused by political correctness dividing us so much. But outreach has to be done incrementally, and the best outreach is one-on-one. Jacques Ellul wrote the classic book on propaganda, and if you get nothing else out of it, this line: propaganda ends where simple dialogue begins. And why would that be? Because all of those caricatures and stereotypes that get thrown onto people who are not with the agendas, the idea is to throw those on to people to drown out their voices, because our personal relationships have the potential to cut through a lot of that. I want to remember the words of Soviet-era freedom fighter Václav Havel, who struggled against groupthink of communism, wrote this essay, The Power of the Powerless, in which he argues that change against totalitarianism has to come from the hidden sphere of private relationships. He says when one person speaks up, something dangerous happens to that regime of totalitarianism. Everyone's more able to peer behind the curtain and see that it is possible to live within the truth. So again, the pushers of thought reform and political correctness may own all the outlets of communication, but what don't they own just yet? They can't prevent people from reaching out in what Havel calls the hidden sphere, because they don't yet control that sphere, which means our private personal relationships and our personal conversations and friendships. The total control of the hidden sphere of private life is the big prize of statist agendas, and SEL, I'm afraid, is set up to invade that hidden sphere, because it's so utopian, it's so collectivist in nature, which means it's tailor-made to stifle open conversation. It stifles friendship and that ripple effect of freedom. As Margaret Thaler Singer reminds us in her book, Cults in Our Midst, the psychotechnology of thought reform, we see this in social media and all that, it's not going to go away. Education, information, and vigilance are needed to keep our minds free, to keep us free. So we shouldn't forget that today's propagandists demand total conformity, because they don't underestimate the power of even one single person to create a ripple effect that impacts history. And I don't think we should underestimate that power either. And on that note, I think we've got 10 minutes for questions and answers. So thanks so much. Thank you.
Fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Look at the SEL movement. You spoke at the end about the need to consider alternate points of view, and I think we'd all would see that there's been, of course, an increase in polarization, whether that's on the liberal side or on the conservative side. So, kind of, what do you see as sort of liberty-centered ways that we can increase, the kind of quality of dialogue in the public square?
Right. Yeah, it's kind of hard now because those conditioned emotional reflexes have set in so deeply with a lot of people. And you're also talking about, when you talk about the public square, you talk about discussing these things with groups. And, there has to be a certain openness to hearing a different point of view. I guess it's critical that people understand that, to use freedom to destroy freedom is not really an option. That needs to be understood, that you give up all of your freedom if you don't allow alternate points of view. I didn't have I didn't have the picture of another book up there called The Rape of the Mind by Joost Meerloo. But one of the things he talks about exactly that question in the book. Obviously, there needs to be an understanding cultivated of, what exactly happens if you allow, people to use freedom to destroy freedom, which, is really what we're seeing. And, but you can't totally shut off other points of view. On the other hand, they got the whole fire in the theater, argument. What can we do? Just build awareness of the importance. Oh, I guess I did have that. Thank you. Yeah. That's one of my dropped ones. Thank you. So that's the book, The Rape of the Mind. He talks about that. But, you know, people just need to understand how dangerous mass conformity is. I mean, mass conformity, he says, leads to mass delusion. I wrote a piece about that book that actually got picked up by Rush Limbaugh a couple of years ago. I wrote the piece. It was called "How to Escape the Age of Mass Delusion" for the Federalist, and it's I really recommend it. But he does talk about that you can't, and also Jacques Ellul in his book Propaganda. You know, he is very fearful that the way technology was moving, and of course, it was 60 years ago. He was fearful the way technology was moving, that we would come to this kind of tipping point. And so it's key to focus more on the machinery again. You know, we say different points of view, the machinery of that operation for mass conformity, and, you know, bringing that up rather than just the separate agenda items.
Stella, isn't using the proper pronoun just good manners?
Oh, there you go. There you go. Well, my preferred pronouns are I and me. So I want you to refer to me every time you talk about me. We say, Stella, use I and me. Now, it's not a matter of manners when you're talking about the destabilization of the entire structure of our means of communicating with each other, which are basic rules of grammar and syntax that aren't supposed to be an infinite list, which is really what it's growing to be. That puts us in a box, really. I mean, if you don't, it just basically allows the powers that be gives them every opportunity to accuse you of discrimination or whatever. I mean, I think you brought up in New York when we spoke. Even that was almost 2 years ago now, wasn't it? When they started that law that if you misgender someone, it's a $250,000 fine. You know, it's just no. It's not just good manners. It's a move to build mass conformity.
Thank you for being here today. That was fascinating,
Well, thank you.
and a little scary. In the promotional video for the SEL content, they mentioned that they're doing a lot of these programs in urban areas.
Right.
How deep is this curriculum and this type of education? How deep are we in here in the U.S.?
Okay, it really has. It's taken off. It's very well funded. Like as I said at the beginning, my whole focus is on like the big picture propaganda connection. And Karen Ephraim, and especially I think Jane Robbins, she's a lawyer with the American Principles Project, has been tracking a lot of that. I think these things always start where the need is greatest, and then the idea is to turn it into kind of a universal program, kind of. I mean, to turn it into make sure it's in everywhere. But yeah, no, it's being used. In fact, if I remember correctly, and maybe somebody else here is familiar with it, it's moving through state legislatures, and I don't know. Last I checked, there was something like trying to be part of Common Core, and like 10 states had signed on, and I think and that's for K-12. But if I'm not mistaken, I think I read, and I think I heard through one of the lectures that on this was that all pre-K has it now. Pre-K. Now, think about that with child development, and you're dealing with the gender thing. It's mind-boggling. I mean, it's like there's no understanding of child development, how children at age 2, 3, they're just navigating the line between reality and imagination. It's really scary. I mean, that's what Mr. Rogers, most of you here are too young to remember Mr. Rogers, but there was a show, he was kind of liberal or whatever on, certain things, but he wrote a song that he used to sing on his show called some are fancy on the inside. It was about the different sex differences. Some are fancy on the outside. Everybody's fancy. Everybody's fine. My body's fancy. So, yeah, your body's fancy. So's mine. And it goes on. And he says, boys are boys from the beginning. Girls are girls right from the start. You know, boys grow up to be the daddies. Girls grow up. Of course, they don't, I mean, you don't hear that about that anymore. But he dealt with those kinds of things, helping young children who's, you know, say, oh, I'm a boy or I'm a girl or whatever, navigate that line, really scary line between reality, and they want structure. They want to know what's real. And if you use one kid who, you know, is different and apply that across the board to mean everybody, I mean, that's pretty dangerous stuff. But anyhow, I'm sorry. I guess that doesn't really answer your question. I'm not sure exactly how deeply embedded it is now, but it's deep. So, any other questions? I really appreciate you all. If anybody has any other questions, I think we have a minute, but Austin, no? Well, I appreciate the opportunities. Oh, one more.
Schools of education or, yeah, I mean, on our side, right, the sort of people who are in any institutions that sort of have imbibed the kind of the, you know, the red pill or whatever it would be.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah, they don't blue pill people. The interesting thing, and I didn't get into this, but you know, one of the board members is, what's her name, Linda Darling-Hammond, who is basically connected with Bill Ayers. And Bill Ayers, yeah, you all know he's the domestic terrorist, very radical 1960s activist. What has he been doing for the past 40 years? He has been out of Chicago. So much of this comes out of Chicago, by the way. I mean, Castle is in Chicago. He has been 40 years focused on education and basically radical education reform in the schools of education so that they are, as Robin Eubanks, who wrote a book, I didn't put it up there, called Credentialed to Destroy, how she put it, so that they are credentialed to destroy. I mean, it's, you know, credentialing to be a teacher. It basically has so many jumping through that hoop in schools of education that they get along with all these programs. So, like I said, it's daunting, and you know, we've got to, you know, think about how to, as cult expert Margaret Thaler Singer said, keep our, you know, understand the psychotechnology of thought reform to help keep our minds free, and that isn't what's happening through a lot of these schools of education. So, thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, my mind, and I didn't even take my mind control pills from Lucy Gigi. Thank you. Bye-bye.
She's really got them. On behalf of the Family Research Council, thank you all for coming here today, and for all of you who are watching online. Thanks again. See you next time.